This experience in the hospital was the deepest chapter I've ever had in my life. There were that many people out there.
He broke Elvis Presley's record, and the world barely noticed. For 50 years, critics called him sentimental, disposable. Rolling Stone made him a punchline. The rock establishment simply looked away. And while all of that was happening, he sold 85 million records. Then, at 82 years old, after 2 cancers and 4 decades of secrets, he posted a photo from a hospital bed with a 2-word caption, "Better today." How did a poor kid from Brooklyn become the most enduring artist in American music history? What did he hide for 36 years from the very fans who loved him most? And what does a man still reach for at this point, after surviving everything? He is not the biggest voice. He never pretended to be. He is not the critic's favorite. He was never once invited to be. Rolling Stone spent a decade mocking him. The rock establishment dismissed him as soft, sentimental, a purveyor of music for middle-aged women who did not know better. They gave their awards to other people. They wrote their glowing profiles about other artists. And while all of that was happening, Barry Manilow quietly became one of the best-selling recording artists in the history of American music. Over 85 million records sold worldwide. 51 top 40 singles on the adult contemporary chart. 13 number ones, a Grammy, a Tony, an Emmy nomination, a Las Vegas residency that shattered the record set by Elvis Presley himself. The man they said did not matter turned out to matter more than almost anyone. But that is not the story. The story is what it cost him to get there. The father who disappeared before Barry could form a single memory of his face. The Williamsburg tenement where music was the only thing that made poverty feel temporary. The marriage that collapsed before it had truly begun. The 20 years spent working in the shadows, arranging other people's songs, writing jingles for McDonald's and Band-Aid while the spotlight belonged to everyone else. The partnership with Bette Midler that launched a career neither of them expected. The secret he carried for 4 decades, a private life hidden from the very fans who loved him most, because he feared the truth would cost him everything. And then, at 82, after surviving throat cancer in 2020, after outlasting every trend and every dismissal and every year that was supposed to be his last, a bronchitis diagnosis that would not resolve led his doctor to order one more test. That test found something on his left lung, something that needed to come out immediately. His surgeon would later tell him plainly, "Your body has been through hell. It needs time to heal." But Barry Manilow was already back on the treadmill, 3 times a day, counting the songs he could sing before his lungs gave out. 1, 2, 3. Not enough for a show. Not yet, but more than yesterday. That is who this man has always been. This is the story of how a boy from Brooklyn, with a borrowed last name and a second-hand accordion, became the most enduring voice of his generation, and what it took to keep that voice alive. He was born Barry Allen Pincus on June 17, 1943, in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. Not the Williamsburg of today, not the boutique coffee shops and art galleries and rents that swallow a month's salary in a week. The Williamsburg of 1943 was tenements and fire escapes, and the smell of something frying in the apartment next door, because the apartment next door was 3 feet from your window, and the walls between you were thin enough to hear every argument, every laugh, every grief. His mother was Edna Manilow, a stenographer. His father was Harold Kelleher, an Irish truck driver whom Edna's Jewish family had barely tolerated from the start. The family made Harold change his surname to Pincus. digging back through his ancestry to find a single Jewish relative from the 1800s, a great-uncle named Pincus, just so the marriage could be presented with something resembling respectability. Barry would later describe the whole arrangement with a kind of rueful humor. They went back to the 1800s, he said, and found one Jewish uncle. They changed my father's name immediately. It did not help. Harold Pincus, born Harold Kelleher, left before Barry was 2 years old. The family allowed no further contact, no letters, no visits, no explanations offered to the boy who would spend the rest of his life writing songs about longing, without ever quite explaining where the longing came from. Barry was raised by his mother and her parents, Russian Jewish immigrants who had built a life in Brooklyn through the sheer refusal to accept that the world owed them anything easier. They were poor, not the kind of poor that people describe with nostalgia, not the kind of poor that becomes charming in retrospect, the kind of poor where a cab driver, decades later, when asked to take you back to that neighborhood, would simply refuse. Ask a cab driver to take you there now, Barry would tell an interviewer, and he will run away. He was, by his own admission, an awkward child. Ugly, he called himself, without self-pity, but without softness either. The ugliest kid in school. He did not have many friends. He was shy in the way that children are shy when the world has not yet given them a reason to trust it. And so he turned inward, the way children without friends always do. And what he found there was music. At 7 years old, Barry started accordion lessons. It was the instrument available, the instrument affordable, the instrument his mother could justify. He practiced. He got good. He played for family gatherings, for his grandparents, for anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. But the accordion had its limits. It was a folk instrument, a parlor instrument, an immigrant's instrument. It did not yet speak the language Barry was beginning to hear in his own head. Then came the stack of records that changed everything. Barry was 12 or 13 when his mother ran into an old friend on the subway. His name was William Murphy. Willie, an Irish truck driver, a friend of Harold Kelleher from years before. Edna and Willie began dating. They eventually married. Barry's grandmother protested, because of course she did. But Willie Murphy turned out to be the man who gave Barry Manilow the keys to an entire musical world he had not known existed. Willie brought home records, not the rock and roll that was sweeping through every other household in Brooklyn in the late 1950s. Barry would later confess that he actively disliked the early rock and roll era, that Bill Haley left him cold, that it took the Beatles, years later, to convince him there was something worth hearing in the genre. Willie's records were different. Sinatra, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Jerry Mulligan, Broadway cast albums from Carousel, and Kismet, and The King and I. When my stepfather came into my life and brought with him a stack of albums that may as well have been a stack of gold, Barry would say, more than 60 years later. He changed my life with just that little stack of records. Willie took him to see Jerry Mulligan play live at Town Hall in Manhattan. Barry would describe it as a thunderbolt. Something cracked open that night. The sense that music was not just entertainment, not just something you played at a family gathering to make the grandparents smile, but a living, breathing architecture of emotion. A structure you could build a life inside of. The family bought a piano, an $800 Wurlitzer that represented a significant sacrifice. Barry took to it immediately, abandoning the accordion with relief. Playing that piano, he would later say, was the beginning of his life. He graduated from Eastern District High School in 1961 and enrolled in the New York College of Music, then continued at the Juilliard School, the most prestigious music conservatory in the country, the institution that trained the best of the best. To pay his way through school, he worked in the mailroom at CBS, sorting mail, learning the building, learning the people, learning how power moved through a room. He was 18 years old. He had come from a slum in Williamsburg. He was walking the corridors of one of the most influential broadcast networks in America. And he was watching everything. In 1964, he married his high school sweetheart, Susan Dixler. She was everything he admired: warm, steady, supportive. The kind of person who believed in him when the evidence was thin. The marriage was real. The love was real. But Barry was already somewhere else in his mind. Already hearing the musical adventure he needed to chase. Already understanding that he was not ready to be a husband. Not yet. Perhaps not the way Susan deserved. He left, he would say later, because of a wondrous musical adventure that pulled him away from everything else. Susan had the marriage annulled in 1966. Barry would carry the weight of that departure for the rest of his life. What happened next was a decade of invisibility that most people never know about. A decade that built everything that followed. He wrote jingles. He wrote them brilliantly. His voice was the one telling you that you deserve a break today at McDonald's. His arrangements were the ones underneath the Band-Aid jingle, the Dr. Pepper commercial, the State Farm campaign. America was humming Barry Manilow's melodies for years before it knew his name. He was the ghost in the machine of American commercial music, present everywhere, credited nowhere. Then, in 1971, a phone call came. A singer named Bette Midler needed a musical director for her residency at a venue in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. The venue was the Continental Baths, a gay bathhouse that had become, in the years after Stonewall, one of the most vital creative spaces in New York City. Barry Manilow showed up for $75 a night. He would later describe it simply as a job. What it actually was, though neither of them fully understood it at the time, was a laboratory. Midler was building the Divine Miss M persona in front of crowds of gay men who demanded authenticity above everything else. Manilow was the pianist, the arranger, the musical director, sometimes playing in a white towel to match the audience, because in that room, formality was the only thing that felt out of place. Night after night, they built something together. He produced her debut album, The Divine Miss M, in 1972. The album launched Midler to national fame, and the producer who made it possible. The man behind the piano, behind the arrangements, behind the sound, stepped back into the shadows and waited. He was nearly 30 years old. He had never had a hit record. He had never had a spotlight of his own. But he had spent a decade learning every room he walked into, learning what made music breathe, learning what made an audience lean forward instead of sitting back. The invisible years were almost over. The phone call that changed everything came from Clive Davis. Davis had just founded Arista Records in 1974, and he had heard about the pianist who had been working the shadows of New York's music scene for a decade. The jingle writer, the arranger, the man behind Bette Midler's sound. He wanted to sign him. More than that, he wanted to make him a star. But first, he needed something specific. "You need a career-making single," Davis told him. Those were his exact words. Barry Manilow never forgot them. Davis sent over a recording, a moderately successful 1972 song by a British writer named Scott English, originally titled Brandy. It had peaked briefly on the charts and faded. Most people had already forgotten it existed. but Davis heard something in the bones of it. A longing, a reaching quality. Something that could be transformed into something else entirely, with the right voice and the right arrangement. The name had to change. Looking Glass had already planted a different brandy at number 1 2 years earlier, and confusion would kill the single before it left the gate. They renamed it Mandy. Barry Manilow recorded it in 1974. On January 18, 1975, Mandy reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was his first chart entry on any Billboard chart. His first number 1. He was 31 years old. America had been hearing his voice for years without knowing it. Now, finally, it knew. What followed in the next 8 years was one of the most sustained commercial runs in the history of American popular music. I Write the Songs in 1975, a song with deep irony that he did not write, but that he sang with such conviction that it felt more his than anyone's. Looks Like We Made It in 1976. Weekend in New England, Can't Smile Without You. Copacabana at the Copa in 1978. A dramatic story song about a showgirl and a lost love that would win him the Grammy Award for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance and become the most enduring anthem of his career. 13 number 1s on the adult contemporary chart, 51 top 40 singles, 85 million records sold worldwide. Frank Sinatra, who did not offer praise casually or cheaply, told the British press in the height of Manilow's popularity, "He is next, and through all of it, through every sold-out arena and every platinum album and every television special, the critics sharpened their knives and used them freely. Schmaltzy, they wrote, bombastic, sentimental, a purveyor of music for middle-aged women who did not know any better. Rolling Stone treated him as a punchline, the rock establishment. The critics who decided what mattered and what did not constructed an entire architecture of dismissal around him, as though the tens of millions of people who bought his records were simply wrong, as though popularity itself was evidence of failure. Barry Manilow did not fight them. He did not chase their approval, did not reshape his sound to win their respect, did not compromise the emotional directness of his music to seem harder or cooler or more appropriate for the era. "I have purposely tried not to stay in sync with the times," he said. "I just do what feels good." What felt good, it turned out, felt good to an enormous portion of the American public. While critics were writing their contemptuous reviews, ordinary people were playing his records at weddings, and on long drives home, and in quiet moments when they needed to feel something they did not have words for themselves. That is what Barry Manilow's music was, a vocabulary for feelings that people carried but could not always articulate. The critics dismissed this as sentimentality. His audience understood it as truth. But behind the sold-out shows and the platinum certifications and the Frank Sinatra endorsement, Barry Manilow was carrying a weight that none of his fans knew about. A private life he had constructed with extraordinary care, hidden behind a carefully managed public persona, protected by the fear of what honesty might cost him. In 1978, at the peak of his fame, the point at which his face was on magazine covers and his songs were on every radio station in America, he met a television executive named Gary Keefe. The meeting was immediate and absolute. "I knew that this was it," Barry would say decades later. "I was one of the lucky ones. I was pretty lonely before that. Gary didn't know what I did, even though I had all these records out. He was a guy, and I was a guy, so we could just deal with each other like two normal people, not like a superstar and a person." Gary Keefe became his manager, then his partner, then, in every meaningful sense, his family. "Gary saved my life," Barry would tell a reporter in 2023. "As my career exploded, it was just crazy." Going back to an empty hotel room, you can get into a lot of trouble if you're alone night after night after night. But I met Gary right around when it was exploding. And I didn't have to go back to those empty hotel rooms. I had somebody to cry with, or to celebrate with. For 36 years, Barry Manilow kept that relationship hidden. Not because he was ashamed of it, not because he doubted it, but because he had built his career in the 1970s on a connection with a fan base that was predominantly female, predominantly devoted, and that he believed, perhaps wrongly, but sincerely, would feel betrayed by the truth. "I thought I would be disappointing them if they knew I was gay," he said. "So I never did anything." The concealment required constant management. He cultivated visible friendships with women. He let rumors form and dissolve. He and Gary lived together, worked together, built a life together in the sharp glass house of public celebrity, and said nothing. In April of 2014, after same-sex marriage became legal in California, they married at their 53-acre estate in Palm Springs. 20 to 30 guests were invited, told they were coming to lunch. They discovered they were actually attending a wedding. "I didn't think it was going to be that emotional," Barry would say. "It was deeper than we thought it was going to be." Looking at each other, saying "I love you" in front of people. News of the marriage became public in 2015. Barry officially came out in April 2017 in a cover story for People magazine. He was 73 years old. He had carried the secret for nearly 4 decades. And the reaction from the Manilows, the audience he had feared losing, the audience he had protected himself from, was not what he had dreaded. It was the opposite of what he had dreaded. When they found out that Gary and I were together, they were so happy, he said. The reaction was so beautiful. Strangers commenting, "Great for you. I'm just so grateful for it." The man who had spent 36 years afraid of his own audience had finally met them fully, and they had been waiting for him all along. But the body, as it always does eventually, began to speak a language that could not be managed or concealed. In 2020, during the height of his Las Vegas residency, Barry Manilow began noticing changes in his voice. Subtle at first, a roughness in certain registers, a fatigue that had not been there before. For a performer whose entire identity was built around the clarity and precision of that voice, the changes were alarming. His doctors investigated. The diagnosis was throat cancer. He underwent surgery. He recovered. He returned to the stage. He was 77 years old, and he had just survived cancer. He announced more tour dates, because that is who Barry Manilow has always been. Not a man who waits for the world to tell him it is safe to continue, a man who continues, and lets the world catch up. By 2023, something was happening in Las Vegas that no one had predicted, and nearly everyone had underestimated. The International Theater at the Westgate, the same room where Elvis Presley had built his legendary residency beginning in 1969. The room that had been the epicenter of the Vegas entertainment world for half a century, was selling out every Barry Manilow performance, not occasionally, consistently. Every show. Night after night, audiences from across the country came to see a man in his 80s stand on a stage and do the thing he had been doing for 50 years, and they left on their feet. On September 21st, 2023, Barry Manilow performed his 637th show at the International Theater. It was one more than Elvis Presley had performed there in his entire lifetime. The record. Elvis's record. The record that had stood untouched since 1976. Belonged to a kid from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, who had been told for decades that his music did not matter. He wore a red jacket with Elvis's TCB lightning bolt logo stitched on the sleeve. He sang Hound Dog as a tribute. He was presented with the key to the Las Vegas Strip, and when he spoke to the audience that night, he said what he had always said. In every room he had ever played, in every decade of a career that had outlasted every trend and every dismissal that had been aimed at it. It really is all about you guys. You know, I love all the awards and all, but I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. The Westgate gave him a lifetime residency, not a contract with renewal options, a lifetime residency. The only one they had ever offered to anyone. David Siegel, the property's founder, put it plainly. Barry Manilow is a generational artist and a dear friend. I am honored to offer Barry the opportunity to perform at Westgate for a lifetime. Barry Manilow responded with characteristic simplicity. I am deeply grateful to have the opportunity to call Westgate home for the rest of my career. It was the rest of his career. It was supposed to be the rest of his career. Then came the bronchitis, 6 weeks of it, a relapse of another 5. And then the MRI that his doctor ordered out of caution because something still did not feel entirely right, and a doctor who paid close attention was not willing to let it go. The MRI discovered a cancerous spot on his left lung that needed to be removed. Barry Manilow had survived poverty. He had survived a decade of invisibility. He had survived the critics who spent 30 years trying to reduce him to a punchline. He had survived the 36 years of concealment and the fear that honesty would cost him everything it hadn't. He had survived throat cancer at 77 and returned to the stage stronger than before. Now, at 82, cancer had come for him a second time. And in a hospital bed in a green gown, he posted a photo and wrote 2 words, "Better today." The surgery was in late December of 2025. His doctors had found the spot early. Stage 1, localized. No evidence of spread to lymph nodes or anywhere else. The tumor was small. The prognosis was good. The surgical plan was clean. Remove it. Let the body heal. Move forward. No chemotherapy. No radiation. Just the operation and the recovery and whatever came after. What came after was harder than he expected. Barry Manilow has never been a patient man. He said it himself, plainly and without self-pity. I have no patience. Sitting still while his body knit itself back together was, by his own description, agony. Not the agony of despair. The agony of someone who knows exactly where he wants to be. On a stage, in a recording studio, in front of an audience. And cannot get there yet. He was on the treadmill 3 times a day within weeks of the surgery. His surgeon had told him his body had been through hell and needed time to heal. Barry Manilow's response to that information was to run on a treadmill 3 times a day and test his voice after every session, counting songs the way a runner counts miles. 1 song, 2 songs, 3 songs. Then the breath gave out, and he stopped. But the next day, he tried again, and the one after that. 3 songs became 4. 4 became 5. The voice that had spent 50 years filling arenas, the voice that had survived throat cancer at 77 and returned stronger than before, was finding its way back again. On March 3rd, 2026, he posted a video for his fans. "Hi everyone, Barry Manilow here. Well, looks like I made it, and I look fabulous, right? You know, with everything that's going on in the world, I wanted to check in and share some good news. In fact, it's great news. It's been a long ride, and since I have no patience, it's been agony. But I am getting stronger, and I have great doctors and wonderful friends and family. And I am so looking forward to getting back on stage. getting back on stage, not resting, not reconsidering, not accepting that, at 82, after 2 cancers, after a body that had given him every reason to stop, that perhaps this was the appropriate moment to finally let the curtain fall. Getting back on stage. He was eyeing a return to his Las Vegas residency at the Westgate by the end of March. Arena dates in April. A full tour schedule stretching through the rest of 2026. A new album. His 33rd studio record, titled What a Time. His first collection of nearly all original material in almost 15 years. Scheduled for release on June 5, 2026. His single Once Before I Go had already reached the top 10 on the adult contemporary chart, extending his extraordinary chart presence to 6 full decades. A milestone that began in 1974 with Mandy and now reaches into 2026. 6 consecutive decades on the charts. No other artist in the history of the adult contemporary chart has sustained that kind of presence across that span of time. The song was executive produced by Clive Davis, the same Clive Davis who had told him in 1974 that he needed a career-making single. The same Clive Davis who had sent him a song called Brandy and told him to make it his own. 52 years later, they were still working together. Some partnerships are built for a season. This one was built for a life. The music video for Once Before I Go was filmed at the Westgate, Las Vegas. His home, his stage, the room he had called the perfect room for him. In the video, Manilow portrays a character who sacrifices a traditional family life to pursue his dream as a performer. The choice of subject was not accidental. It was autobiography rendered as art, the way his best work has always been. The emotional truth underneath the arrangement, the thing he was actually saying beneath the melody. Because Barry Manilow did sacrifice a traditional family life to pursue his dream. He sacrificed a marriage he genuinely valued, to chase a musical adventure he could not explain but could not ignore. He spent decades carrying a private life hidden from the people who loved him most, because he did not yet trust that they could hold the full truth of who he was. He built something extraordinary at enormous personal cost, and then discovered, at 73, when he finally let the secret go, that the cost had been unnecessary, that the people who loved his music were capable of loving the man who made it. What he found instead of the traditional family he had not built was something that suited him more honestly. Gary Keefe, his partner, his husband, his manager, his companion for nearly half a century. The man who made the empty hotel rooms disappear. The man who was there to cry with and celebrate with through every decade of the extraordinary thing that Barry Manilow's life became. They raised a daughter together. Gary's daughter, Kirsten, who grew up to work in the family business. And in 2023, Kirsten adopted a little girl, making Barry Manilow, the boy from Williamsburg who had spent his childhood lonely and poor and certain that the world owed him nothing. A grandfather. I've never ever thought about having a baby or having anything to do with being a father or any of that, he told People magazine. I'm watching this little girl. She's 2.5. Grow up and learn. This is a brand new experience for me, and I really am enjoying it. The treadmill, the voice exercises, the recording studio visits during recovery, the new album, the return to Las Vegas, the arena tour, the 6 decades on the charts, and the 33 studio records, and the 85 million albums sold, and the Grammy, and the Tony, and the lifetime residency in the room where Elvis once played. All of it from a kid who grew up in a slum that cab drivers now refuse to visit. All of it from a boy who changed his name at his bar mitzvah, because his father had already disappeared, and a borrowed surname was the only inheritance available. All of it from a man who spent 10 years invisible, writing jingles for hamburger chains and bandage companies, waiting for the room that would finally be his. The critics were wrong. They were wrong in 1975 when they called him schmaltzy, and they were wrong in 1985 when they predicted his decline. And they were wrong in every year since when they implied. With the weary condescension of people who confuse taste with truth, that what Barry Manilow did not matter. It mattered to 85 million people who bought his records. It mattered to the audiences who filled the International Theater night after night and stood on their feet at the end. It mattered to the kids in the schools that the Manilow Music Project supplied with instruments. Millions of dollars in resources donated so that other children growing up without much might find, as Barry Pincus once found, that music is the thing that makes poverty feel temporary. And on a morning in early 2026, after surgery and recovery and agony and treadmills and voice exercises counted in careful increments, it mattered to an 82-year-old man in a recording studio in Las Vegas, adding his voice to a new track, building one more thing that would outlast whatever the doctors had found on that MRI. The title of his new album, coming in June of 2026, is What a Time. What a time indeed. What a time it has been. From Williamsburg to Juilliard. From the CBS mailroom to the Continental Baths. From Mandy to Copacabana. To a Las Vegas stage that holds his name where Elvis's once stood. From a cancerous spot on a lung to a treadmill 3 times a day. To a microphone and a new song, and an audience that has been waiting, with characteristic devotion. For him to come back, Barry Manilow came back. He always comes back. If this story has moved you, leave a tribute below for the boy from Brooklyn who outlasted everything, the poverty and the critics and the silence and the fear and the cancer. Twice. And is still, at 82, writing the next song. And wherever life finds you tonight, remember this. Endurance is its own kind of genius. The ones who are still standing when the dust clears are not always the ones the world predicted. Sometimes they are the ones everyone forgot to count.